Bumpy realized he couldn't defeat the Italian and Jewish mobs in a straight-up war on Broadway, so he changed the battlefield and he turned Harlem into a maze of shadows. He enforced a rule of silence: no loose talk, no public threats, no unnecessary blood in the streets. Instead, he built a network of ghosts, men who moved quietly, spoke rarely, listened always. They would strike from the darkness and disappear before the police or Schultz's gunmen could even react. No warnings, no headlines, no speeches, just results. And Bumpy himself would often walk through Harlem alone, calm, measured, untouchable. That silence, that discipline, it drove Dutch Schultz mad because he wasn't fighting a rival anymore. He was fighting a shadow, an enemy he couldn't see, an enemy who refused to play by the loud, bloody rules of the New York mob.
Born in 1905 in Charleston, Ellsworth's journey began with a small bump on the back of his head, a bump that earned him a nickname he would carry to his grave: Bumpy. But it wasn't the bump that defined him. It was his fierce intelligence and an even fiercer temper. In the segregated South, that kind of fire could get a young black boy lynched, so at just 10 years old, his parents put him on a train north. Destination: Harlem. They thought they were sending him to safety. They didn't realize they were sending a wolf into the perfect hunting ground. In the 1920s, Harlem was the mecca of black culture, but beneath the glitter of the jazz clubs lay a brutal underworld. This was the era of the numbers game, a daily lottery, the financial heartbeat of the community. Bumpy began as a small-time enforcer, a bodyguard for the legendary Queen of the Numbers, Stephanie St. Clair, and in the shadows of the Madame, he learned his first real lesson. In the underworld, muscle gets you in the door, but brains keep you in the room. The turning point came when the Italian mob decided Harlem's riches belonged to them, led by the volatile, almost psychopathic Dutch Schultz. Schultz didn't negotiate. He absorbed, he crushed. And one by one, Harlem's bankers of the underground folded. Most people ran. Most people paid tribute. But Bumpy Johnson did the unthinkable. He refused. Not quietly, not strategically at first, he declared a full-scale street war against the most powerful mob syndicate in America. Gunfire echoed through Harlem's avenues. Bodies fell. Alliances shifted overnight. This wasn't just business anymore. It was survival. It was sovereignty. And in that chaos, something changed. The local hustler disappeared. In his place stood a street general. Bumpy didn't just fight the war, he managed it, calculated it, disciplined it. He created rules, territory lines, understandings, because muscle could win battles. But structure wins empires. And those rules kept him on the throne for over 30 years. Bumpy Johnson's reign wasn't an accident. It was a calculated masterpiece built on 5 unbreakable rules. And the first rule, the one that kept his enemies blind and his allies loyal, was the power of strategic silence. Let's step into the shadows. In the underworld, your mouth can be your best friend or your worst executioner. One careless sentence can cost you everything. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. While other gangsters chased attention bragging about their kills, flashing their cash, feeding their egos, Bumpy practiced something far more powerful: silence. He wasn't loud. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't need to dominate a room with noise, because when Bumpy Johnson spoke, people leaned in. And when he finished, they remembered. This wasn't just personality, it was discipline. It was calculation. It was strategy. In a world built on paranoia, the loudest man is the easiest target. But the quiet one? The quiet one is studied, feared. By staying silent, Bumpy became a ghost, impossible to predict, impossible to read, and nearly impossible to defeat. The true test of that rule came in the early 1930s. Dutch Schultz, ruthless, volatile mobster with a psychopathic temper, set his sights on Harlem, specifically the Harlem numbers game. He didn't want partnership, he didn't want negotiation, he wanted it all, total control, total submission. So he launched what could only be described as a campaign of terror. Operators were kidnapped, storefronts were bombed, bodies appeared in alleyways, message received, fear spread quickly. Bankers of the numbers game locked their doors. Whispers replaced confidence. Most of Harlem's leadership was paralyzed, not by weakness but by survival instinct. Because Schultz didn't posture, he punished. And every explosion, every disappearance, was meant to send one message: resistance is fatal. But Bumpy Johnson, he didn't scream, he didn't pound tables. He didn't make public threats. There were no dramatic speeches, no reckless retaliation. He went silent. While Schultz was making noise, Bumpy was making plans. And in the underworld, noise attracts attention. Silence wins wars. Bumpy understood something critical. He could not defeat the Italian and Jewish mobs in a straight-up shootout on Broadway. Not in open daylight, not on their terms. So he changed the battlefield. He turned Harlem into a maze of shadows. Every alley became a corridor, every rooftop a vantage point, every storefront a listening post. The streets no longer belonged to Schultz. They belonged to the dark. Bumpy weaponized his rule of silence. He built a network of men who didn't boast, didn't linger, didn't leave signatures. He built a network of ghosts. They struck without warning. A car window shattered, a convoy ambushed, a messenger intercepted. And before the police or Schultz's hitmen could even draw their breath, they vanished. No witnesses, no speeches, no revenge theatrics, just absence. And at the center of it all, Bumpy Johnson, often walking through Harlem alone. No visible security, no panic, no urgency, calm, measured, untouchable. That silence infuriated Dutch Schultz, because he wasn't fighting a rival anymore. He was fighting an idea, an enemy he couldn't see, an enemy who refused to play by the loud, bloody rules of the New York mob. And in that invisible war, Bumpy Johnson was winning. Eventually, Schultz's aggression began to fracture his own empire. His volatility, his temper, his recklessness turned allies into critics, because power without discipline is dangerous to everyone. And while Schultz made enemies, Bumpy Johnson stayed quiet, professional, measured. Behind closed doors, he opened channels, not with street soldiers, but with the commission. The heads of New York's 5 Mafia families. To them, Schultz was becoming a liability. Too loud, too unstable, too unpredictable. But Bumpy? He was disciplined, strategic, a man you could actually do business with. In 1935, inside a tavern in Newark, New Jersey, Dutch Schultz was shot multiple times by his own syndicate. The decision had been made. The loud, angry giant was dead, and Harlem was still standing. The silent, calculated king remained on his throne. Bumpy Johnson had won a war against the most powerful mobster in the city, without ever raising his voice. Rule number 1 taught Bumpy that information is the most valuable currency in the world. The math was simple. If you don't talk, you don't give it away. Today, in an age of social media, where everyone is desperate to be heard, Bumpy's silence stands as a masterclass in power. 1432 to 1442. He understood a fundamental law. The man who watches from the shadows is the one who truly controls the light. But silence was only half the battle. To keep his throne, he needed the people. And that leads us to rule number 2, philanthropy as a shield. To the FBI, Bumpy Johnson was a menace, a high-level criminal, a trafficker, a gambling kingpin, a name in a federal file marked for surveillance. But in Harlem, he was something entirely different. He wasn't a case number. He wasn't a target. He was known as the Robin Hood of the ghetto, because while he profited from the streets, he reinvested in them. Rent paid for struggling families, turkeys handed out at Thanksgiving, legal fees covered, school clothes bought quietly, no press conferences, no speeches. Just action. Bumpy understood a truth that most dictators, and most kings, eventually forget. You cannot rule a kingdom if the people want you dead. Rule number 2 was about building a shield. Not a shield of steel, not concrete walls, but a shield made of human loyalty. During the Great Depression, and the years that followed, Harlem was neglected. Factories closed, jobs disappeared, landlords showed no mercy, poverty wasn't hidden. It was everywhere, and when institutions fail, a vacuum forms. Bumpy Johnson stepped into that vacuum. He didn't just accumulate wealth, he redistributed it. Quietly, deliberately, strategically. When widows were days away from eviction, rent was paid. When young men needed a chance, he bought them suits for job interviews, not flashy gifts, not public gestures, practical solutions. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, Bumpy reportedly spent thousands of dollars to make sure no family in Harlem went without a hot meal. Tables filled, children fed, dignity preserved. To outsiders, it looked like generosity. To the FBI, it looked like manipulation. But to Harlem, it felt like protection. And here's the strategic truth. This wasn't charity. It was an investment in loyalty, in silence, in community defense. By becoming Harlem's provider, Bumpy Johnson made himself indispensable. And a man who is indispensable is almost impossible to remove. This philanthropy was more than goodwill. It created the most sophisticated intelligence network in New York City, not built on wiretaps, not built on paperwork, built on people, from the shoe shiner on the corner to the grandmother in the tenement window. Everyone owed Bumpy Johnson a favor, and favors are a powerful currency. Without paying a salary, without issuing instructions, he had thousands of unpaid spies, eyes on every block, ears in every hallway. Harlem was listening for him. If a federal agent stepped into a bar, Bumpy knew within minutes. If a rival crew whispered about a hit, a waiter would overhear it. A janitor would notice something. A neighbor would pass a message. Information flowed upward, quietly, constantly, like a nervous system feeding a brain. And Bumpy Johnson was that brain. The police called it obstruction. They called it fear. But they found it nearly impossible to get witnesses to testify against him. Why would they? When the state ignored their pain, Bumpy paid their medical bills. When landlords threatened eviction, Bumpy intervened. He didn't just rule Harlem, he became Harlem. There's a legendary story. One night, police were chasing Bumpy Johnson through the streets of Harlem, sirens closing in, footsteps echoing behind him, the net tightening, with nowhere left to run. Bumpy slipped into a crowded apartment building, doors slammed, lights flickered on, the police stormed in seconds later. But something unexpected happened. Instead of pointing him out, the residents hid him. They blocked hallways, they crowded stairwells, and when officers demanded answers, they gave them the wrong directions. Third floor. No, he went out the back. I saw him head toward Lenox. Confusion, delay, misdirection, and just like that, Bumpy was gone. They weren't protecting a gangster. They were protecting their benefactor. The man who paid rent when landlords wouldn't wait. The man who bought food when cupboards were empty. This was the shield, in action, not steel, not concrete. Human loyalty. Bumpy understood something profound. As long as the people stood with him, the law was powerless. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man of the people. He was a man of the mind. He understood something critical. Popularity fades, muscle weakens, fear expires. To remain at the top for more than 3 decades, he had to be the smartest person in every room he entered, even if that room was a prison cell. Because true power isn't just physical, it's intellectual. This brings us to rule number 3, intellectual supremacy, and the unlikely classroom that forged it, Alcatraz. Most gangsters see prison as a dead end, a cage, a punishment, a forgotten chapter. For Bumpy Johnson, it was a university, a place not just to survive, but to evolve. Over his lifetime, Bumpy spent more than a decade behind bars, including time at the most infamous prison in America, Alcatraz. But while other inmates lifted weights, played cards, or plotted escapes, Bumpy sharpened something far more dangerous: his mind. He embraced rule number 3, in a war of muscles, you might win a battle. But in a war of minds, you win the empire. He wasn't just a street boss anymore. Behind those prison walls, he was becoming a philosopher of power. In the early 1950s, Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to Alcatraz for drug conspiracy, the island prison, a fortress surrounded by cold water and colder men. He now stood among the most dangerous criminals in America. But Bumpy didn't blend in. He stood out. While reputations inside Alcatraz were built on violence, his reputation began to grow for something else. Intellect. He became a voracious reader. Books weren't an escape for him, they were ammunition. He studied law. He studied history. He devoured classic literature. Shakespeare, philosophy, strategy. He even wrote poetry. Verses reflecting on power, struggle, and survival. Some of it would later be published, behind bars. His mind was expanding, and that intellectual discipline gave him something his rivals lacked: perspective. He began to see the underworld not as chaos, but as structure. To Bumpy, the streets were no different from the corporate world. Both were built on leverage, on psychology, on understanding people's fears and desires. Short-term aggression might win territory, but long-term planning, that built empires, and Bumpy was thinking in decades. He wasn't playing checkers, he wasn't reacting to moves, he was anticipating them. Bumpy Johnson was playing grandmaster-level chess. When Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem in 1963, the world he left behind no longer existed. The streets had changed, new gangs were rising, young, ambitious, reckless, and downtown, the Italian Mafia was stronger than ever. For most men, that kind of shift meant one thing: war. But Bumpy Johnson was not most men. He didn't come back with guns blazing. He didn't rally soldiers. He didn't make threats. He made appointments. Instead of declaring war, Bumpy sat down with the heads of the 5 families. These were the most powerful crime bosses in America. Men who controlled unions, ports, construction, politicians. And Bumpy didn't walk in as a subordinate. He walked in as an equal. What made that possible wasn't muscle. It was what he called intellectual supremacy. Bumpy had spent years studying law, studying economics, studying power. He understood something most gangsters didn't. Violence is expensive. War drains money. War attracts police. War destabilizes business. And Bumpy framed the conversation that way. Not emotionally, not personally, financially. He laid it out plainly. A war in Harlem would cost everyone millions. Police pressure would increase. Federal investigations would follow. Supply chains would collapse. But a structured peace, under his guidance, would make everyone richer. Stable territory, predictable percentages, clear lines of authority. No chaos, just profit. He didn't ask for permission. He presented terms, and the most powerful crime bosses in America did something remarkable. They listened, because Bumpy Johnson understood a truth that many feared to admit. In the end, the man who controls the money controls the room. And in 1963, Harlem, that man was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson's love for chess was never just a hobby, it was philosophy. While other men studied weapons, Bumpy studied the board. To him, every street corner was a square. Every police officer a piece in motion, every rival a calculated threat. He didn't react to problems, he positioned around them. Chess taught him something most men in his world never understood. The game isn't won by the fastest move, it's won by the smartest one. Bumpy trained himself to think 6 months ahead. If he made a move today, he already knew the counter. And the counter to the counter. Pressure didn't shake him. Raids, betrayals, territory disputes. While others panicked, Bumpy observed, calm, silent. Calculating, because he believed a leader's greatest weapon wasn't his trigger finger. It was composure. To outlast enemies, you had to outthink them. To control the streets, you had to control the room. And by the mid-1960s, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just back in power, he was more powerful than he had ever been. Because now he wasn't just playing the game, he was designing it. But intelligence, without discipline, is a recipe for disaster. Bumpy Johnson watched brilliant men rise fast and fall even faster, not because they lacked vision, but because they lacked control. Ego, impulse, greed. He saw smart men destroy empires over a single bad decision, a single emotional reaction, a single uncontrolled desire. Bumpy understood something critical. Power isn't lost in chaos, it's lost in carelessness. To maintain his empire, he lived by a code of ironclad professionalism. No loose talk, no public outbursts, no unnecessary risks. Which brings us to rule number 4, iron discipline. Now we look at the man behind the suit and the habits that kept him alive. By the 1960s, the streets were changing. A new generation was rising. Younger, louder, flashier. They chased attention. They chased quick money. Some even consumed the very products they sold. It was chaos disguised as ambition. But Bumpy Johnson remained a relic of a more disciplined era. He didn't move like the new hustlers. He didn't talk like them. He didn't think like them. Because Bumpy followed one unbreakable principle. Rule number 4, iron discipline. He didn't see himself as a street thug. He saw himself as a CEO, a man running operations, managing risk, protecting assets. Every meeting mattered, every word carried weight, every appearance sent a message. In the underworld, your image is your currency, and your discipline is your armor. Lose control of yourself and you lose control of your empire. Bumpy understood that survival wasn't about being the loudest man in the room. It was about being the most controlled. One of the most remarkable things about Bumpy Johnson was his restraint. He lived in a world built on temptation, unlimited drugs, alcohol on demand, high-stakes gambling. Every vice imaginable was always within reach, and yet he rarely touched any of it. Bumpy understood something dangerous about indulgence. The moment you depend on a vice, you lose leverage, you lose clarity, you lose control. And in his world, control was everything. He watched as heroin began tightening its grip on Harlem. He saw what it was doing to the community. Families collapsing, young men fading, neighborhoods weakening from the inside out. Now make no mistake, Bumpy profited from the trade. Through his tax on the Italian mobs, money flowed upward. But there was a line. He famously kept heroin away from his inner circle. No one close to him was allowed to fall into addiction. Because addiction creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites betrayal. While rivals sampled their own supply, while younger hustlers chased the high, Bumpy stayed sober, clear-eyed, observant. He stayed sharp while others dulled their instincts. That clarity gave him an edge, because leadership in the underworld is not about emotion, it's about calculation. When disputes erupted, when alliances shifted, when life and death decisions had to be made, Bumpy didn't hesitate. His mind wasn't clouded, his judgment wasn't compromised. He operated with cold surgical precision. In a world intoxicated by excess, Bumpy Johnson's greatest advantage was discipline. For Bumpy Johnson, Violence was never personal. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reckless. It was professional. He wasn't a hothead. He didn't explode in rage. He didn't lash out to prove a point. When violence happened, it happened for one reason only: necessity. If someone threatened the structure, if someone endangered the money, if someone disrupted stability, Bumpy responded. Not with fury, but with calculation. Because to him, violence was a tool. And a tool is only used when absolutely required. That professionalism created something unusual. Even the police and eventually the FBI developed a strange level of respect for him. Not approval, not admiration. Respect. He wasn't a loose cannon they had to stop at all costs. He wasn't triggering random chaos. In many ways, he was a stabilizer. Under Bumpy's watch, Harlem didn't spiral into constant bloodshed. There were rules, boundaries, structure. He enforced iron discipline over his men. No unnecessary shootings, no reckless behavior, no drawing attention without purpose, because attention meant pressure, and pressure meant lost revenue. Bumpy understood a fundamental truth. A quiet neighborhood is a profitable neighborhood. If businesses could operate, if residents felt relatively safe, if the streets weren't flooded with random violence, money flowed. Predictably, consistently. And that was the goal, not chaos, control. He ran Harlem, like a Swiss watch, precise, measured, always on time. Bumpy Johnson's day-to-day life was surprisingly boring for a so-called godfather. There were no dramatic entrances, no secret bunkers, no constant paranoia, just routine. He woke up early, read the morning papers, studied headlines, politics, police movements, economic shifts. Information was part of his discipline. Because information meant preparation. He held meetings in public restaurants, not dark warehouses, not hidden back rooms, diners, cafes, places where ordinary people gathered. He made himself visible, comfortable, present. He spent time with his wife, Mamie Johnson. Maintained appearances, maintained stability, maintained routine. And that routine became his greatest defense. It made him predictable to his friends, but impossible to catch off guard for his enemies. Because predictability, in his case, was controlled. Deliberate, every movement calculated. By living a disciplined, visible life, Bumpy Johnson hid in plain sight. He wasn't hiding underground. He wasn't barricaded behind steel doors. He was sitting in a diner calm, observing, ready for whatever the day threw at him. Discipline kept him alive. It protected him, stabilized him, made him untouchable for decades. But Bumpy Johnson understood something most powerful men refused to accept. He wasn't immortal. Every king eventually falls. Every empire changes hands. The only real question is, what happens after you're gone? Does everything collapse? Or does your name survive? That brings us to the final and, perhaps most important rule of all. Rule number 5, legacy, and the final move. Now we look at Bumpy's final days and how he ensured his name would live forever in the underworld. By 1968, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had been the king of Harlem for over 30 years. In the underworld, that's not just a career, it's a miracle. But Bumpy knew that every empire has an expiration date. Rule number 5 was his final strategy. Legacy. He understood that a man can be killed, but a legend is immortal. As he entered his 60s, he wasn't just focused on controlling the streets. He was focused on how he would be remembered. On the night of July 7, 1968, Bumpy walked into his favorite spot, Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. He was surrounded by his people in the heart of his kingdom. He ordered fried chicken, a cup of coffee, and a slice of home-style cake. As he ate, he suffered a massive heart attack. He didn't die in a hail of bullets. He didn't die in a cold prison cell. He died in a place he loved, eating the food he enjoyed, as a free man. In the world of organized crime, this was the ultimate victory. Dying on your own terms. Bumpy Johnson's funeral was one of the largest in Harlem's history. Over 5,000 people filled the streets to say goodbye. There were the numbers kings. the powerful Italian dons, and thousands of ordinary men and women people whose rent he had quietly paid, and whose children he had helped feed. From a distance, the FBI watched in silence. After years of chasing a criminal, they were now witnessing something else, a community mourning its king. When Bumpy died, he didn't just leave behind an empire. He left a vacuum. And in that empty space rose chaos, the turbulent reign of Frank Lucas, and the violent drug wars that would consume Harlem in the 1970s. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a crime boss. To many, he was the glue that held Harlem together. Strategic silence, philanthropy, intellectual supremacy, iron discipline, legacy. These weren't just principles Bumpy Johnson admired, they were the pillars of his survival. He moved through some of the most dangerous decades in American history and emerged not forgotten, but legendary. Hero or villain, the debate continues. But one thing remains undeniable: his brilliance. Bumpy Johnson may be gone, yet in the shadows of the underworld, his name is still whispered. The real question is, which of his rules will you apply to your own life? Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Bumpy Underworld. If you enjoyed it, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, who should we deconstruct next?